Well, we are just hours away now from the sentencing of Jerry Sandusky.
That's right, and here's the only question really you want to know is how many years he will be locked up. Sandusky, the former Penn State defensive coach, will be sentenced tomorrow morning for sexually assaulting young boys. Some of the attacks happened in the locker rooms at Penn State. The judge has a lot of leeway on the sentencing. It could be as little as 10 years or as long as 400 years. Sandusky's own lawyer is predicting it'll be so long he'll die behind bars. Two of the jurors are saying that he deserves life without parole.
I really feel that Jerry should get life in prison. He really should, because he, as I said, did this to these young boys, and that's just, it's just awful, just unacceptable. Unfortunately, I think Jerry is a sick man.
And I would like to see him speak, too. I'd like to see what he has to say. Whether he apologizes or not, I just want to see kind of from him, like what's going on in that head of his, you know? What is he really thinking, and what would he want to say?
And you know, what happened at Penn State has implications here in Florida.
Yeah, it inspired a new law in Florida called the Penn State Law, and it makes it a crime not to report abuse. Tampa attorney Anthony Rickman says this law is a big deal. How tough is the new law, though? Anthony joins us now live here. Anthony, could this lead to some false reports as well, you think?
Well, every time you're dealing with children and the potential of abuse, it always leads to false reports. But the statute in and of itself protects against that by making it a fine to actually make this a false report. And when you talk about the toughness of this statute, critics are saying it's the toughest statute or toughest legislation related to child abuse in the country.
Well, talk about what the statute says.
Basically what it says is it creates a mandatory reporting requirement to anybody who suspects that a child is abused or has knowledge of a child's abuse. Now, previous legislation only created a special class of mandatory reporters. Now, everybody, every citizen, every person in the state of Florida is a mandatory reporter. Failure to report alleged abuse or suspected abuse or knowledge of abuse now results in a third-degree felony, which is punishable by up to 5 years in the Florida State Prison and a $5,000 fine.
Now, what about children and teachers? We know teachers are spending a lot of time, in some cases as much time as our parents are. How might this law impact our teachers?
The legislation itself creates a new training program for teachers to look for abuse. Now, the teachers were previously required to report it. They are now still required to report any suspected abuse. What we're going to see here is teachers taking that extra step. If they suspect abuse, err on the side of a caution, report it to law enforcement or the abuse hotline, and make the claim.
But what's so huge about this is that anybody, you know, as you said, a neighbor, a teacher, if they fail to report it. So it seems to me, how are they going to go about finding out that that person knew and didn't say anything?
Well, that's going to be a job for investigators. And you see, for instance, the Penn State case where Mr. McCreary walked in on a boy being raped. That is a clear fact where he knew and didn't report it. You may see a child coming to school every day with bruises, injuries, things that any person may see. And a family member or caregiver who sees that child every day didn't make that report. Now, one of the things with this legislation is this: it protects the most vulnerable of our victims, and that's children from the ages of 1 to 4. And the reason these children are very vulnerable is because they're not in school. They're not dealing with teachers. This law creates now a mandatory reporting requirement for anybody. So if a neighbor may suspect that 4-year-old or 1-year-old child who's not in school of being abused, they're required to report it now. As in the past, there was no requirement for anyone except for teachers, doctors, social workers, or a specified class of people.
Anthony Rickman's a defense attorney here in the Tampa Bay area. Anthony, we appreciate your perspective. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you for having me.